Hello, fellow travellers, and welcome to episode number 11 of The Apple and the Hero. My name is Sara Orfali, and today I would like to be your guide on the pathways of history. It is estimated that since the very beginning, some 108 billion people have walked on our planet Earth. The majority of them have lived and died without leaving even the smallest trace. But some, whether by choice or by accident, have left an indelible mark on our history. And for those who did leave their mark, an even smaller handful has done something so characteristic, something so important, that contemporaries or even posterity has chosen to remember them with the title of great. The reasons behind this greatness are not always the same, for there is no one single objective criterion for greatness. Some were called great for their exceptional efforts in different fields, like Pope Gregory I Magnus. Some were given the title posthumously, mostly by their descendants, to bolster their nobility, like William I, Emperor of Germany. Some were called great during their lifetimes, from people who wanted to ingratiate them, like Louis XIV of France, now known not as Louis the Great, but as Louis the Sun King. Most earned their title through great deeds and revolutionary actions. That much is true for the characters on whose path we're about to embark today. He not only succeeded in conquering the greatest empire of his time, but he also dragged his entire army on an adventure which, through misfortune, war, and calamities, would bring them short of the end of the known world at the time. There is no evidence that he was ever called great during his lifetime, but his ambitions, talents, and charisma were surely well recognized, both then and now. He was a man of many crowns. He was the Basileus of Macedon, the hegemon of the Hellenic League, the king of kings of Persia, the pharaoh of Egypt, and the lord of Asia. And he could have been so much more had death not taken him in his prime. I'm sure you've all recognized him, my fellow travellers, and so it's without further delay that I welcome you onto the path of Alexander the Great. For a man who unfortunately lived only until he was 32 years old, Alexander the Great had one of the fullest lives a person could ever expect. Ruler of his own kingdom by the time he was 20, seated on the highest throne of Persia not even 3 years later, Alexander must have seemed to have everything going for him. His life is so eventful that we struggle to think that all of that happened in just a dozen years. It is because it happened in such a short span of time that his exploits have become legends in their own right, so familiar to us that we almost regard Alexander the Great as an old friend. Gaius Julius Caesar wept on his tomb, bitterly realizing that he, a Roman commander of 33 years of age, had yet to achieve anything of import, despite being 1 year older than Alexander at his death. Napoleon Bonaparte, on account of his campaign in Egypt, felt connected with the Macedonian king, enough to be convinced that he too would have founded an empire had he remained in the East. Since his death, Alexander the Great has been the role model for statesmen, his accomplishments something all of posterity wanted to imitate. Before we delve into this path any further, I just want to say one thing. There are over 1,000 between monographs and articles on Alexander written in the last century alone. The amount of material we have on him, even without the eyewitness accounts, which has sadly gone lost, is astonishing. Therefore, I have decided to split the path, so to say, take some breather during our quest to find him. The way is divided in 3. I hope by the end of this part 1 to have piqued your curiosity enough to keep travelling with me. In order to properly get to know someone, how they looked is an important thing to know. So, what did Alexander look like? Is the mosaic at the Casa del Fauno in Pompeii a good likeness? Maybe. Maybe not. Since the original painting was done by Apelles, who had worked directly for Alexander, there is a good possibility that this was his appearance. But in the past, paintings were also used to convey specific messages, and the appearance of the ones portrayed could be altered to match those messages. Some historians think this is what happened to Alexander the Great and his images. Some features of the iconography may have been specific to him, but as far as we know, his real appearance could have been way different than how he wanted to be seen. Did he really have a leonine mane? Or was it a way to link him to Heracles, the godly ancestor of his father's line? The images we have of Alexander all portray him with long, full hair, a bulging forehead, and bright, gleaming eyes. According to an ancient physiognomic treatise, all three of these traits are supposed to portray strength, bravery, and supernatural powers. In the end, Alexander's portraits were less about the man he really was and more about sending one single message. He was a man fit to rule. As I mentioned before, I have divided Alexander's story in 3 parts, which correspond more or less to the time before he became Basileus of Macedon, his childhood, if you want, his Persian campaigns, and his mad adventure to the end of the known world. A man like Alexander, who went on to conquer the greatest empire on earth at the time, inscribing his name not only in history but also into legend, cannot have had a humble and dismissible beginning, right? Correct. According to the earliest sources that we have, the omens had predicted the greatness of Alexander even before his birth. There are several legends surrounding his birth and his childhood. As I said, there have been thousands of works on Alexander since his death in the 4th century BC, but I will mostly be referring to 3 of them. Arrian's Anabasis of Alexander, Plutarch's Life of Alexander, and the so-called Alexander Romance, whose author is unknown. According to Plutarch, as Olympias, Alexander's mother, was about to consummate her marriage to Philip II of Macedonia, she dreamt that her womb was struck by a thunderbolt. At the same time, Philip II was said to have dreamt he had secured his wife's womb with a seal engraved with a lion's image. These sound a lot like ancient pre-wedding night jitters to me, but the ancient historians gave them quite another meaning. If you're even vaguely familiar with the Greek pantheon, whether because you've studied the academic treatises or because you're a fan of Disney's Hercules like I am, you know that the thunderbolt is Zeus's weapon, and the lion is usually associated to Hercules, son of Zeus. Interpretations varied, but the most mainstream in antiquity was that, like Hercules, also Alexander was a son of Zeus. It's certain that from a certain point onwards, Alexander himself spread this interpretation far and wide, even if he never considered himself divine, just the son of a god. In the event that a connection to Zeus and Hercules could be considered paltry, Plutarch adds that on the day of Alexander's birth, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus, burned down, allegedly because Artemis herself had left it unattended to preside over Alexander's birth. And if adding Artemis to the mix still wasn't enough, the ancient sources mentioned that Olympias was a devotee of a Dionysian cult, worshipping snakes, and that she routinely slept with reptiles in bed. Quite a godly pedigree, don't you think? But pre-birth omens are worth nothing if the child grows up ordinary. But even in his childhood, Alexander was far from ordinary. When he was 10 years old, a trader from Thessaly arrived at Philip's II court with a horse. It was a magnificent beast, and the trader wanted an exorbitant sum for it, 13 talents, which is roughly the equivalent of $364,000 today. It wasn't just the price which had made the horse unsellable, it was also its reputation. that beast of a horse was considered a man-eater. Philip II, quite rightly, didn't want to have anything to do with such a ferocious beast no one could even approach, and which was said to have eaten all of his previous prospective owners. But Alexander relished the challenge. He had noticed that the horse seemed to shy away from its own shadow, and so he kept it looking towards the sun, and was finally able to mount it and tame it. Alexander named the beast Bucephalus, meaning ox head, and the horse would become the king's greatest and most loyal companion, accompanying him as far as India, and then being honoured at its death with a city named after it. Along with a smattering of other equines, including the Duke of Wellington's horse, Copenhagen, and Napoleon's famous white horse, Marengo, Bucephalus can be considered a legendary figure in its own right. Plutarch stated that Philip II was overjoyed at his son and heir's display of courage and ambition, going in so far as to declare, and I quote, "My boy, you must find a kingdom big enough for your ambitions. Macedon is too small for you." He then forked over the exorbitant amount of money to the trader and bought the horse. Alexander's accomplishments are his own, and nobody is saying the contrary, but his life at his father, Philip II's court, prepared him well for what was to come. It's probably an exaggeration to think of Philip II as Alexander's lodestar, and Alexander himself made it very clear that he despised being compared to his father in any way, shape or form, especially if he was found lacking. But it is true that some of Philip II's accomplishments paved the way for the glories of his own son. Being nominated tutor and regent by his dying older brother Perdiccas III for his underage nephews Amyntas IV brought Philip in range of a throne he, as the third son, should never have seen. Within a year, he had unscrupulously expropriated his nephew of his right to rule and declared himself King of Macedonia. An appropriately timed purge weeded out the opposition to his claim, leaving Philip II free to rule. Even if Philip II had had no other achievements, he would have been worthy of remembrance just for this. He was the one who put Macedonia on the map. The Kingdom of Macedonia was a small state on the periphery of archaic and classical Greece, so much removed from the rest of Greece that even though Macedonians spoke a variation of a Greek dialect, nobody else could understand them. The Macedonian people were not considered Greeks by the other city-states, regardless of the many attempts of proving a direct connection with heroes and gods, and a lack of bureaucracy and a disorganized and weak military had only contributed to the isolation they suffered. Trying to get recognized through bureaucracy wouldn't get the small kingdom anywhere. It wasn't that bureaucracy was an unheard of concept, but the entire kingdom had as many bureaucrats as the city-states of Athens, which were an awful lot for one single city and very few for an entire kingdom. The entire structure of government rested on the shoulders of a king, who, as per tradition, was always accessible to his subjects and was called by his name without any kind of title. As this had always been the way of doing things in Macedonia, the moment he accessed the throne, Philip II basically ran a one-man show until the day of his death. And while such a way of governing would be of great help to his son Alexander in taking his troops to the end of the world, it didn't give him any solid basis when it came to actually create a cohesive structure of government for all the lands he had conquered along the way. Unfortunately for him, Alexander didn't leave any legacy after his death. His mighty empire was divided between his generals and crumbled soon after his death. Back to Philip II for the moment, though. Building on the military knowledge that he had acquired during his years as a hostage in the city of Thebes, as a student of the great Theban statesman Epaminondas, Philip II's first act as a basileus was to reform the military. Until that moment, the main star of the army had been the cavalry corps. Like everywhere else, those were comprised of upper-class people, mostly nobles, who could afford the upkeep of a horse and an armor. The infantry was the peasants' corps, badly armed, even worse armoured, and better known for their speed in retreat than for their capabilities in battle. This was the corps Philip II concentrated his efforts on. The first thing he did was having the state taking over the costs of weapons and armours. It was definitely quite an eye-watering amount of money to invest, but as Philip II saw it, if it gave him an infantry capable of going into battle since it was finally fitted for it, then the returns were greater than the expenditures. The king increased the discipline and the training for his soldiers and provided them not just with equipment, but also with the possibility of promotion through the ranks and rewards and bonus wages for exceptional services. It was now possible for the men to make a living out of being a soldier. Now that he had raised the infantry corps as a whole, Philip II set out to create an elite force within it, the Macedonian phalanx. This is an infantry formation that has traversed history as one of the most versatile and effective infantry units of all times. The Macedonian phalanx was based on the Greek hoplites phalanx, with the difference that each phalangite carried as his primary weapon a sarissa, a spear of over 6 meters in length and weighing about 6.5 kilos, developed by Philip II himself for this new formation. With his new longer range of the sarissa, the Macedonian phalanx could attack without getting too close to the enemies. The phalangites were also called foot companions, a title, that of companions, previously reserved only to the elite cavalry serving the king directly. It is thanks to the Macedonian phalanx that Alexander conquered the Persian Empire, and such a unit would go on to become the standard in pitched battles until the arrival of the even more maneuverable Roman legion. It is interesting that centuries after Philip II, in a land far away from Macedonia, a young Scottish commander would come up with almost the same military unit, which would secure him the battle which made his name eternal. But that is a story for another time. With this new military wonder, it was time for the Macedonians to enter the stage. A series of war campaigns against the Greek city-states, mostly headed by Athens, culminated in the Battle of Chaeronea, which saw the Macedonians pitted against an alliance between Athens and Thebes. Despite mostly running a one-man show, Philip II did give his son space to thrive and occasions to prove himself. The Battle of Chaeronea was one such occasion. The newly appointed general, Alexander, a position he had reached when he wasn't even 18 years of age, was the first to break the ranks of the elite infantry of the Thebans, a blow so grave that the victory can be partially credited to him. As a consequence of the Macedonian resounding victory, Philip II became the hegemon, or supreme ruler of what is known as the Hellenic League, an alliance of Greek city-states. With his goal of having his kingdom recognized complete, Philip II set out to make new alliances. Rather than go on a conquering spree, like his son would do in the future, Philip II opted for a marriage policy, which would not appeal to Alexander in the slightest, given that he only married once when he was almost at the end of the world. Philip II was, as mentioned, running a one-man show, which meant that rather than give away his daughters, sons, or any other relative at his disposal, and his loyalty could be turned against him, Philip put himself forward for a series of diplomatic marriages. Traditionally, Macedonia, like the rest of Greece, practiced monogamy, but Philip II opted for polygamy. He married 7 times, allegedly 6 for reasons of state, and the last one because he had finally fallen in love. Plutarch, quite uncharitably in my opinion, writes that Philip II had fallen in love with a girl when he was past the age for it. Despite the number of wives, Philip II didn't father many children. Only 7 in total, 3 of whom males. Contrary to what we might be inclined to believe, Alexander wasn't the firstborn male. He had an older half-brother, Arideus, who, according to the historians of old, had either some learning disabilities or some form of psychiatric disorder. There is no possibility of a diagnosis today, not when most of the sources regard Aridaeus as stupid or of unsound mind. This meant, though, he wasn't considered a candidate for the throne. In any case, the Macedonian throne wasn't necessarily passed to the oldest male child, but to the worthiest. With Aridaeus unfit to rule, Alexander had been deemed the worthiest candidate, a fact that he himself cemented with a series of successes in his youth, like his capable handling of the Mede rebellion when he was only 16 years old, which ended with the foundation of his very first city, Alexandropolis, and his courageous charge at the Battle of Chaeronea. Always according to Plutarch, as a consequence of his exploits, Philip II was excessively fond of his son, and even rejoiced when, and I quote, he heard the Macedonians call Alexander their king, but Philip their general. While this last part sounds a little bit like an exaggeration, it's clear from the sources that we have that Philip II did dote on Alexander. When Alexander had reached 13 years of age, right on the cusp of adulthood for the time, Philip II, recognizing his son's talents and his right to succeed him, assigned him a tutor. Chosen not only for his academic prowess, but also for his family connections and personal experiences, this tutor and Alexander would go on to forge one of the most famous mentor-student relationships in history. This man was none other than Aristotle. The role of Aristotle in Alexander's life was pivotal and cannot be underestimated, not only because as his tutor he shaped him into becoming an enlightened ruler and great commander, but also because it was Aristotle who first lit a Homeric fire in Alexander. It sounds like a bad cliché, but it seems as if Alexander wasn't a good student, much more interested in the art of war than in philosophical discussions. To keep his attention, Aristotle would reward him with readings from the Iliad, stoking a fire which would burn through Alexander until the end of his life. From a young age, Alexander saw himself as Achilles, of whom he was a descendant from his mother's side, and each of his closest companions got an Homeric counterpart as well. With Hephaestion, his best friend, with whom historians think Alexander had a relationship, even though we are not quite sure if platonic or not, taking the role of Patroclus. Considering that Hephaestion died young, I would say it was a pretty bad omen from the start. Not only Philip II had given Alexander the best education on the market in that moment, he had also surrounded his son with carefully selected youths, plucked from other noble or regal families, in some cases hostages, in other simply sent to the Macedonian court. Those youths were called the royal pages, and while Philip II couldn't have known this when he created this unit, many of these would end up being Alexander's personal companions, and then go on to inherit his vast empire at his death as the Diadochi. Unfortunately for them, despite their solid upbringing, they would end up falling short of Alexander's greatness. While the relationship between father and son might not have always been idyllic, according to the historians, there seemed to have been no reason for Philip II to ever deny Alexander's status as heir. But while the father might not have wanted or needed to choose another successor, the son wasn't so easily convinced about the unchangeability of his role. And with good reasons. Alexander's fear all stemmed from the same place. Until the moment his father had married his seventh and final wife, Eurydice, called Cleopatra, the one he had married for love, just so we're clear, Alexander had been quite sure of his position. After all, except for his cousin Amyntas IV and a smattering of other male relatives of minor importance, his only real competition for the throne had been his elder half-brother Aridaeus, to whom nobody would have handed the throne. The moment Philip II married Cleopatra, though, things started to shift in the Macedonian court. Up until that moment, each of the 6 wives Philip II had married had come from one of the neighboring kingdoms. Alexander's mother, Olympia, for example, had been a Molossian princess from Epirus. All the children conceived until that moment had mixed ancestry, Macedonian on the father's side and a foreign one on the mother's side. But then Philip II married Cleopatra, who was the only full Macedonian wife of the lot. This clearly meant that the children from this union would be the only ones fully Macedonian. As far as we know, such a detail didn't matter to Philip II, who had already chosen and groomed Alexander as his heir, but some members of the court, especially Cleopatra's family, kept hinting that any children from this union, especially if males, would make a better heir to the throne in the future. Alexander's fears, quieted over the years but never fully buried, returned with a vengeance. The most vocal supporter of this possibility was Attalus, Cleopatra's uncle, who, on the day of his niece's wedding, roaringly drunk, brazenly declared such a thought out loud. Alexander, just as inebriated, answered with a scathing, "Who am I then, a bastard?" followed by a cup thrown at the guest. To complete such a Dionysian scene, in order to stop the two of them, Philip II himself had descended from his throne, sword in hand, ready to dole out punishments. Pity that he had overindulged in wine as well, and so he tripped over his own 2 feet and fell down, fortunately without causing damage either to himself or to another guest. With a tongue loosened by the wine, and probably a wounded ego, Alexander is said to have looked at his father in askance and uttered these words: "Look now, men, here is the one who's preparing to cross from Europe into Asia, and he is upset in trying to cross from couch to couch." But why was Alexander so unsure about his position and future? Sure, there was no written document finalizing his succession, but Philip II had done a lot to show his son and the rest of Macedonia that Alexander was his choice. Fanning the flames of Alexander's insecurity was none other than his mother. Olympias was a driven woman. Her main desire was to see her son on the throne as the legitimate heir to Philip II, and she wasn't above employing immoral and underhanded tactics to see it done. There's absolutely nothing in the sources suggesting that Olympia's feelings had evolved beyond petty jealousy, which brought about a divorce between her and Philip II, but rumors are easy to sprout and difficult to cull, and a lot of them have been pinned on her during the centuries. In any case, it didn't seem as if Attalus' drunken comments had caused a permanent rift between father and son. And after having stormed out of the wedding banquet and having spent 6 months in self-imposed exile in Illyria, Alexander was persuaded to return to his father's side. It was clear, though, that even away from the court, currently in Epirus as she was, Olympias could wreak havoc. Sure, Philip II had already divorced her, but in doing so he had left his relationship with Epirus uncovered, and so he had to keep playing nice with his ex-wife. It was probably in a bid to reduce her influence and keep his ties with Epirus intact that Philip II organized a marriage alliance, surprisingly not with him as the groom this time. He gave his daughter Cleopatra, Alexander's only full-blooded sibling, to his brother-in-law, Alexander I of Epirus, Olympia's brother. I would suggest you don't look too closely at the family tree here. Unfortunately for Philip II, this deviation from his marriage policy, the one which had led him to be the groom in every marriage alliance until that moment, would cost him dearly. Philip II would never see if his plan to bypass Olympias would work. He died the day after the joyous event, killed by one of the very people who were meant to protect him. His death would change history, giving his son Alexander the first stepping stone to greatness. Our journey ends here for today, my fellow travelers. As much as Alexander had already proved himself as an adult, his childhood really ended here with the death of his father, Philip II. In front of him, the road to his desires had finally opened up, but he would need to prove himself first, not just as a designated successor of the previous ruler, but as a great commander and king in his own right. I hope I've enticed you enough to keep on travelling with me. Subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss the next installment in 2 weeks and spread the word. As always, all the research and the writing for this episode has been done by me, Sara Orfali, Doctor in History. Goodbye for now. Safe travels.